Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Mark Davis, a 23-year-old law student, walked down the slick streets of a small town in Texas, his mind racing with worries. The rain poured steadily, making the already overcast sky look even grayer. Mark had a full day ahead of him, juggling his last year of school, a part-time job, and debts left by his late father. The weight of it all seemed to press against his chest. He was barely keeping his head above water. Mark's thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone. A call he didn't expect. Mark Davis speaking, he answered, his voice tight, trying to keep his nerves in check. Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's about your financial situation. Mark frowned, feeling a mixture of confusion and caution. I'm sorry, who are you? How do you know about me? I know enough, she replied coolly. Let's meet at Brooks Bistro, 7:00 p.m. It's important. The call ended abruptly before Mark could respond. Mark stood there for a moment, phone still pressed to his ear, his mind racing. Eleanor Brooks? The name meant nothing to him. He had no idea how she knew about his financial troubles, but her tone told him this was serious. He couldn't afford to ignore it. He made his way to the bistro, each step feeling heavier than the last. The rain soaked through his jacket, and he tried to shake off the feeling of dread settling in his stomach. The bistro was small, warm, and smelled of fresh coffee. It was a nice place, certainly more upscale than Mark was used to. He scanned the room and spotted a woman sitting at a corner table. Eleanor Brooks. She looked every bit the part of a powerful, polished woman in her tailored suit, silver hair styled impeccably. Mark hesitated, then walked over and sat down across from her. She didn't greet him with a smile, but with a calm, assessing look. Mark, she said, her voice firm but not unkind, thank you for meeting me. Mark gave a half-hearted nod, trying to ignore the growing unease in his chest. Of course, Mrs. Brooks. What's this about? Straight to the point, I like that, she said, taking a sip of her tea. Let's get to the matter at hand. I know about your debts. The ones your father left behind. I know you're struggling to make ends meet. And I can help you with that. Mark blinked, confused. How? Eleanor set down her cup and met his gaze. I'm here with an offer. A business arrangement. I need a husband, and you need financial stability. Marry me, and I'll take care of your debts. I'll ensure your future. Mark stared at her in disbelief. Was this some kind of joke? A business arrangement? He had heard of things like this in the movies, but never thought they'd happen to him. What's in it for you? He asked, his voice skeptical. She smiled faintly, her eyes narrowing slightly. I'm a woman with no family left, Mark. No children. No one to leave my wealth to. I need a companion, someone to help solidify my legacy. It's not about love, it's about security. And you need security, don't you? Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of his situation pressing down on him again. He had always prided himself on his independence, but now, the idea of a marriage that offered him the financial relief he so desperately needed was tempting. But the very thought of it made him feel uneasy. He was being asked to give up his pride for something that felt so transactional. Still, what choice did he have? His mother's medical bills were piling up, and his younger sister's tuition loomed over him like a dark cloud. Could he really say no to this offer? He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. I need time to think about it. Eleanor didn't push him, but her piercing gaze remained fixed on him. Of course. Think carefully, Mark. This offer won't last forever. Mark left the bistro that night with more questions than answers. He was torn, caught between his desperation and his pride. Could he really marry a woman he didn't love just to save his family? As he walked through the rain-soaked streets, his mind replayed her words over and over. Marry me. A business arrangement. It seemed so simple, yet it felt wrong in so many ways. But Mark had always been the responsible one. He had to make the right choice. He had no idea yet what that choice would be, but he knew he had to make it fast. As he reached home, his mother sat at the kitchen table, looking at him with weary eyes. She had seen the weight on his shoulders and knew it all too well. The financial strain, the never-ending pressure. Mark knew that whatever decision he made next, it would change everything. So, what would it be? Should he take the deal and sacrifice his pride, or turn it down and risk losing everything? To be continued. Mark walked home that evening, the weight of Eleanor's proposal still pressing on his mind. He had never imagined he would be in a situation like this, where the line between desperation and pride became so blurred. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle as he trudged down the familiar path to his small apartment. He passed by the same old shops, the ones that were always just barely getting by, just like him. His thoughts kept circling back to Eleanor's words, to her cold, calculated offer. Marry me, and I'll take care of your debts. I'll ensure your future. Her words echoed in his mind, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong about this arrangement. But was he really in a position to say no? Inside his apartment, Mark dropped his backpack on the worn-out couch and collapsed into the chair, rubbing his temples. His mother's medical bills were piling up, and his sister's tuition fees loomed ahead like a dark cloud. Every day, it felt like they were slipping further into a hole they couldn't get out of. Mark had always been the responsible one, the one who worked hard and sacrificed for his family. But now, it seemed like everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. Was he really willing to trade his self-respect for money? For a future that seemed so uncertain? He glanced around the small, cramped apartment, the same place he had lived in for the past few years, ever since his father passed away. It was a far cry from the luxurious world Eleanor had described. And yet, here he was, being offered a way out, a way to secure a future for himself and his family. He thought about how much he had sacrificed to keep everything together. He had put his dreams on hold, all in the name of responsibility. But now, Eleanor's proposal seemed like a lifeline, one that he was too scared to reach for. He wasn't sure if he was ready to give up his independence, but he was certain that if he didn't take this opportunity, he might lose everything. Mark leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as his thoughts ran wild. Could he really go through with it? Marrying a woman he barely knew, simply for financial security? It felt wrong, but how many times had he wished for an easier way out of this never-ending cycle of debt? Could he live with himself if he said no? He didn't know. He didn't know anything anymore. Just as he was about to make a decision, his phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from his mother. Mark, I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this. The hospital called today, and they're starting to get impatient with the bills. I know you're doing your best, but I can see how much it's weighing on you. Please, take care of yourself too. You're all I have left. Mark's heart sank as he read the message. His mother never asked for much. She had always been the strong one, but now she was starting to crack under the pressure. He had promised her that things would get better, that one day, he would be able to give her the life she deserved. But every day, he felt like he was failing her. The weight of her words hit him harder than anything Eleanor could say. You're all I have left. Mark sat in silence for a long time, his phone still in his hand. The decision seemed impossible, but the reality was clear. He couldn't continue like this. His mother's health, his sister's future, his own sanity, all of it was on the line. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like there was no other choice. Eleanor's offer, while difficult to swallow, was the only way to ensure his family's survival. But at what cost? Could he live with himself if he went through with it? Or would he always wonder if there was another way? The sound of a knock on the door pulled Mark from his thoughts. He stood up, his mind still clouded with uncertainty. When he opened the door, there stood his mother, looking frilier than ever, her face etched with concern. "Mark," she said softly, "I know you're under a lot of pressure, but please remember you don't have to carry all of this alone." Mark looked at her, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He didn't know what to say. He had always tried to protect her, tried to shield her from the harsh reality of their situation. But now, it was clear that he was the one who needed help. Maybe it was time to accept that. Maybe it was time to let go of his pride and take the help that had been offered. "I'm just trying to figure out the right thing to do," Mark whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't want to let you down." His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "You're not letting me down. You're doing everything you can. But sometimes, even the strongest people need help. Don't be afraid to ask for it." Mark nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had never realized how much he had been carrying until that moment. He had been so focused on doing everything himself, on protecting his family, that he had forgotten to take care of himself. Maybe it was time to let someone else take the burden for a while. The next day, Mark made his decision. He called Eleanor, ready to accept her offer. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't keep fighting this battle alone. To be continued. The next morning, Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. He had made up his mind. There was no turning back now. He knew the call to Eleanor would change everything. His hands trembled as he dialed her number, the weight of the decision heavy on his chest. The phone rang for a moment before her voice came through, cool and steady as ever. "Mark, I was hoping you'd call," Eleanor said, her tone devoid of any surprise, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. "I've thought about it," Mark replied, his voice tight. "I'm ready to accept your offer." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Mark could hear Eleanor breathing, calculating. "Good," she said finally, her voice softening just slightly. "We'll begin immediately. There are a few things to arrange. I'll have my lawyer contact you." Mark swallowed hard. He had known this would happen, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel all too real. A business arrangement. A contract. A marriage based on necessity, not love. Later that day, Mark met with Eleanor's lawyer at a cafe downtown. The lawyer was professional, impersonal, and had a stack of papers ready for Mark to sign. It felt like a business deal, and in many ways, it was. Eleanor's wealth would solve his family's problems, but the price was steep. He was about to marry a stranger. A woman he had met only briefly, for a business proposition. The lawyer handed him the documents, explaining each clause. No love was required. They would live separate lives in public but would maintain the illusion of a perfect marriage for the sake of appearances. The arrangement would help solidify Eleanor's position in the eyes of her family and business associates. It all seemed too cold, too calculated. Mark's stomach churned as he read through the terms, but in the end, he knew what he had to do. "It's all in your hands now," the lawyer said, pushing the papers toward him. Mark signed without hesitation. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but there was no turning back. He was locked into this contract, and with it, he was sealing his fate. The following week, the marriage took place in a small, private ceremony. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a few close associates and a simple exchange of vows. Mark stood at the altar, dressed in a suit he had never imagined wearing. He had never thought he would marry for anything other than love, but here he was, standing next to Eleanor Brooks, a woman he barely knew. When the ceremony was over, Eleanor gave him a brief, polite smile before turning to greet her guests. There was no warmth in her expression, no emotion. It was as if this was just another business transaction. And for her, it probably was. Mark's heart was heavy as he walked out of the ceremony. He had done it. The deal was sealed. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a huge mistake. Was this really the best choice for his family? He couldn't help but wonder if he had given up too much in exchange for the financial stability Eleanor had promised. Over the next few days, Mark settled into his new life. He moved into Eleanor's luxurious penthouse, a world away from the cramped apartment he had lived in for years. Everything was different now. The sleek, modern furniture. The expansive view of the city skyline. The silence that filled the vast space. It all felt alien to him, like he was living someone else's life. He tried to keep to himself, staying in his room when he wasn't needed for public events or appearances. Eleanor remained as distant as ever, treating him like an employee rather than a husband. She didn't ask about his day, nor did she offer any personal details about hers. Their interactions were brief, practical, and nothing more. But despite the coldness of their arrangement, Mark couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was beginning to shift. Every time he saw Eleanor, he noticed little things. The way she carried herself, confident and composed, but with a hint of vulnerability when she thought no one was watching. The way she would sigh when she thought he wasn't looking, a fleeting moment of weariness crossing her face. Mark couldn't help but wonder what lay behind the perfectly crafted facade. Eleanor was a woman of power and wealth, but was she truly happy? Was this arrangement working for her as much as it was for him? He hadn't signed up for a marriage of convenience with the hope of finding love, but he couldn't help but feel drawn to her in ways he didn't fully understand. Late one night, as Mark sat by the window, looking out at the city lights, Eleanor entered the room. She was dressed in casual clothes, her hair loose and slightly tousled, as if she had just come from a long day at work. For the first time since their marriage, she didn't look like the polished, unapproachable businesswoman he had come to know. She paused when she saw him, as if surprised by his presence. There was a brief moment of silence before she spoke. "I didn't expect to find you here," she said softly, her voice almost tentative. Mark turned to face her, unsure of what to say. The silence between them was thick, but for the first time, it didn't feel uncomfortable. "I'm just thinking," he said quietly, his voice low. "I never thought I'd be here, in this place, in this life." Eleanor nodded, her gaze drifting toward the city below. "Neither did I." For a moment, they both stood there in the quiet, neither one knowing what to say next. The weight of the decision they had both made seemed to hang in the air, unspoken. To be continued. The days that followed felt like they were passing in a blur. Mark and Eleanor continued to play their parts in the arrangement, but the cracks in their impersonal marriage were starting to show. Despite the coldness between them, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. Every time they interacted, there was an undercurrent of something unspoken, something more than the business deal they had signed. But neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge it. Mark spent most of his days at the penthouse, adjusting to this strange new life. Eleanor was constantly busy with her work, attending meetings, managing her empire. Their time together was limited, and when they did cross paths, it was often brief, like two strangers passing by each other in the hall. Yet, despite the distance, Mark found himself more and more intrigued by her. It was during one of these rare moments when they actually spent time together that Mark felt the shift. Eleanor had invited him to join her for dinner in the penthouse, a casual meal after a long day. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair pulled back loosely. There was no polish, no facade, just a woman unwinding after work. It was the most real he had seen her since they had met. They sat across from each other at the dinner table, the silence between them feeling less strained than usual. Eleanor was not the same woman who had offered him a marriage of convenience, nor was she the cold, calculating CEO he had first encountered. There was something more, something human behind the walls she had built. "I never thought I'd be in this position," Eleanor said, her voice softer than usual. She looked at him, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment before she looked down at her plate. "Married for a business deal. It feels strange." Mark was silent for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He had been feeling the same way, but he hadn't dared to say it out loud. The contract had seemed like the only way forward, but now, sitting across from her, he realized how much they had both given up. "Yeah," Mark said, his voice quiet, "I didn't think I'd end up here either." He paused, glancing at her. "But we did what we had to do, right?" Eleanor nodded, but there was a faint sadness in her expression. I don't know anymore, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've spent so much of my life building this empire, but now I don't know if it was worth it. Mark frowned, not fully understanding. What do you mean? Eleanor sighed, leaning back in her chair. I've spent my whole life trying to prove that I'm strong, that I don't need anyone. I made myself into this untouchable person. But now, I'm starting to wonder if it was all for nothing. If it cost me the one thing I really needed. She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with something Mark hadn't seen before: vulnerability. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had always seen Eleanor as untouchable, unreachable, but now, for the first time, he saw a woman who was just as lost as he was. A woman who had built her entire life around a mask of control, only to find that it had left her empty. The tension between them grew, not the kind that came from their contract or the coldness of their arranged marriage, but the kind that came from an unspoken understanding. Both of them had sacrificed their real desires in exchange for security, but now that they had what they thought they wanted, neither of them felt fulfilled. You're not alone, you know, Mark said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. You don't have to do everything by yourself. You don't have to keep up this perfect image. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find something she had been missing. It's hard, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know how to let go. How to trust again. Mark felt a tug at his heart, something deeper than he had expected. He wasn't supposed to care. This was a marriage of convenience, nothing more. But the more he spent time with her, the more he realized he was starting to care about Eleanor in ways he hadn't anticipated. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with the weight of their shared moment. Mark found himself leaning forward slightly, as if drawn to her vulnerability. He wasn't sure where this would lead, but in that moment, he couldn't deny that something was beginning to change. After a long pause, Eleanor finally spoke again, her voice quieter than before. I never thought I would get here, Mark. But now that I am, I don't know if I can keep pretending. Mark swallowed hard, feeling his own emotions rise. You don't have to pretend with me, he said, his voice steady. Not anymore. Eleanor looked at him, her gaze softening, and for the first time since their marriage, Mark saw a flicker of something real in her Aisa connection they hadn't acknowledged before. The night ended quietly, but the air between them had shifted. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time, they both felt like they were no longer playing a role. They were simply two people, searching for something they hadn't expected to find in each other. To be continued. The days following that dinner were a strange mix of tension and tentative connection. Mark and Eleanor continued to live their lives under the same roof, but now there was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet shift that neither of them could ignore. Every interaction, no matter how brief, felt different. There was a softness to Eleanor's presence now, a vulnerability she had never shown before. And Mark, despite himself, found himself drawn to it. They still kept their distance in public, maintaining the appearance of a couple for the sake of the business arrangement. But when they were alone, there were moments of real connection, moments that Mark couldn't help but treasure. Eleanor, for the first time, wasn't hiding behind the facade of a perfect, untouchable CEO. She was just Eleanor, a woman who was struggling, just like him. One evening, after a long day, Mark was in the living room, looking out at the city below. The view from the penthouse was breathtaking, but it did little to ease the discomfort that had settled in his chest. He could feel the weight of his choices, the uncertainty of his future. Was he really going to continue with this arrangement, or was it time to walk away? He didn't know the answer yet. But something in his heart told him that this wasn't just about money anymore. His thoughts were interrupted when Eleanor entered the room. She was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, her hair loosely tied back. For once, she didn't seem like the polished, perfect woman he had first met. She seemed real. The kind of real he had started to long for. "Mark," she said, her voice softer than usual. He turned to face her, his heart skipping a beat at the way she looked at him. Hey, he replied, trying to hide the emotion he felt creeping up on him. What's up? Eleanor hesitated for a moment, as if unsure of what to say. I've been thinking, she started slowly. About everything. About this arrangement. I don't know what I expected when I asked you to marry me. But I think I've been living in this bubble for so long, I forgot what it means to just be human. Mark listened intently, his heart racing. He had never seen the side of her, the side that wasn't in control, the side that was uncertain and, for once, vulnerable. You don't have to do everything alone, Eleanor, he said gently. It's okay to ask for help. You've spent so much of your life building this empire, but you don't have to keep it all together by yourself. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his face. There was something raw in her gaze, something that made Mark feel like she was finally letting down her walls. I know, she whispered. I don't know how to stop. How to let go. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He had always been the one to hold everything together, to keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. But looking at Eleanor now, he realized that they were both trapped in the same cycle. She had built an empire, but it had come at the expense of her happiness. And he had fought to protect his family, but it had come at the expense of his own dreams. Maybe we can help each other, Mark said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. Maybe it's time to stop pretending. We're not perfect, Eleanor. We're both figuring it out as we go. But that's okay. It's not about having it all figured out, it's about finding a way to move forward together. Eleanor's eyes softened, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw a flicker of hope in her gaze. It was fleeting, but it was there. I don't know what that looks like, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I think I want to try. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Mark knew this wasn't going to be easy. They were both so far from what they had once been, so far from what they thought they wanted. But there was something in Eleanor's voice, something in her eyes, that made him believe they could find a way forward. Over the next few days, things began to shift between them. They started spending more time together, not just for appearances, but because they genuinely wanted to. Mark found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't expected. And Eleanor, though still guarded, seemed more willing to share parts of herself that she had kept hidden. One evening, after a long day of working on a project for Eleanor's foundation, they sat together in the living room, the city lights casting a warm glow on the wall. Mark glanced at Eleanor, who was sitting across from him, her eyes focused on the book in her hands. You know, Mark said casually, breaking the silence, I never thought I'd be doing something like this. Helping out with your foundation, I mean. Eleanor looked up from her book, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. I never thought I'd have someone to help either, she said softly. But I'm glad you're here. The simple words hit Mark harder than he expected. It wasn't just about the money, or the deal, or even the marriage. It was about the connection. They were beginning to build something real, something he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Not because of the financial security, not because of the contract, but because he was starting to believe in something more. To be continued. As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor continued to navigate their unconventional marriage. What had started as a simple business arrangement was slowly becoming something more complex, something neither of them had expected. Their time together was still limited, but now, there were small moments that made Mark believe that maybe, just maybe, this was more than he had bargained for. It wasn't just the quiet dinners or the shared glances across the room. It was the way they had started to communicate without words, understanding each other in a way they never had before. Eleanor, once so distant and closed off, was beginning to open up, letting Mark see sides of her that no one else had witnessed. And Mark, once burdened with the weight of responsibility and pride, was beginning to feel lighter, as if the walls around his heart were slowly coming down. One evening, after a particularly stressful day of meetings and calls, Eleanor came home earlier than usual. She was visibly tired, her usual composure slipping just enough to reveal a hint of exhaustion. Mark, who had been working on a project in the living room, looked up when she entered, his gaze softening when he saw her. "Long day?" Mark asked, setting his laptop aside. He had gotten used to seeing Eleanor in control, always polished, always in charge. But tonight, she looked human. Eleanor smiled wearily, sitting down on the couch next to him. "You could say that," she replied with a quiet laugh. "Some days, it feels like I'm carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders." Mark glanced at her, sensing the vulnerability in her voice. He reached out, gently placing his hand on hers. It wasn't something grand or dramatic, but the simple gesture felt like a turning point. Eleanor didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something she hadn't realized she needed. "I know what that feels like," Mark said softly. "I've been carrying a lot for a long time. But, we don't have to do it alone." Eleanor's breath hitched slightly, and for the first time, Mark saw her defenses falter. She leaned into him just a little, her head resting on his shoulder. The silence between them wasn't awkward or uncomfortable, it was a quiet understanding, a moment of connection they hadn't shared before. They sat like that for a while, the only sound in the room being the soft hum of the city outside. Mark couldn't help but think how much had changed between them. Just a few weeks ago, they had been strangers, bound by a contract, each of them playing a role they had never expected. But now, it felt different. Eleanor had stopped being the unreachable billionaire, and Mark had stopped being the man burdened with endless responsibilities. Together, they were starting to find something real. The next day, as they prepared for an event that evening, Eleanor's assistant called with the news that her business partners had arrived in town earlier than expected. Eleanor was scheduled to meet them at the gala, and there was a sudden rush of planning. Mark could see the familiar tension creeping back into her demeanor, her carefully curated image as the powerful CEO resurfacing as she got ready for the evening. "You look beautiful," Mark said quietly as Eleanor stepped into the living room, dressed in an elegant black gown that accentuated her natural grace. She smiled at him, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of something deeper. I don't know if I'm ready for another evening of pretending." Mark's heart ached at her words. He could feel the weight of her doubts, her internal struggle. "You don't have to pretend with me, Eleanor," he said, his voice steady. "We don't have to be perfect." Eleanor met his gaze, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "Maybe we don't," she whispered. "But sometimes, I feel like I've built this entire life around being perfect, and now I'm not sure who I am without it." Mark reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly. "We're both figuring this out. But we don't have to have all the answers right now." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic revelation, just two people, standing together in the quiet of the moment, sharing something raw and real. Later that evening, as they attended the gala, Mark couldn't help but notice how different Eleanor seemed. She still exuded confidence, of course, but there was a certain softness in her movements, a quiet reassurance that she didn't have to be perfect to be strong. As they made their way through the crowd, interacting with guests and colleagues, Mark could see that for the first time, Eleanor was letting her guard down. And in that moment, he realized just how far they had come. By the end of the evening, as they stood in the quiet of the ballroom, Mark looked at Eleanor and smiled. It wasn't a smile of triumph or relief, it was simply a smile of connection, of understanding. They were no longer just two people bound by a contract, they were two people who had found something real in each other. As they left the event, walking side by side, Mark knew that things were changing between them, slowly but surely. They weren't there yet, but they were getting closer. And maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to figure out what it meant to trust each other and themselves. To be continued. The weeks that followed were filled with moments of quiet transformation. Mark and Eleanor continued their arrangement, but now it was something different. It was no longer just a business deal, they were starting to build a life together, even if they hadn't fully realized it yet. There were still times when the weight of their situation felt overwhelming, but there was also a sense of hope, a belief that maybe they could make this work after all. One evening, after a long day at work, Mark came home to find Eleanor sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in hand. She wasn't wearing the polished suit she usually donned for meetings and events. Instead, she had on a simple sweater and jeans, looking more relaxed than he had ever seen her. "Hey," Mark said as he entered the room, surprised to find her there, already home. He had gotten used to her busy schedule, and the sight of her at home in the middle of the evening was a rare treat. Eleanor looked up from her glass and smiled, the warmth in her expression surprising him. "I was thinking," she began, her voice soft. "We've been living in this, in-between world for so long. I'm not sure what we're doing anymore. But maybe it's time to stop pretending that everything's fine when it's not." Mark's heart skipped a beat. There was something different in her voice, a vulnerability that he hadn't heard before. It was as if, for the first time, she was truly letting her guard down. "What do you mean?" Mark asked, his voice careful, not wanting to push her but also wanting to understand. Eleanor took a deep breath, setting her wine glass down on the table. "I've been living in a bubble for so long, trying to make everything perfect, trying to control everything. But I realize now that I've been so focused on keeping up appearances that I've forgotten what really matters. I've forgotten how to let people in." She paused, looking at him, her eyes searching his face. "And I don't want to keep doing this alone. Not anymore." Mark could feel the walls inside him that he had built for so long start to crack. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding back too, how much he had buried beneath his responsibilities and fears. But here was Eleanor, admitting something he hadn't expected from her: a desire for real connection, for something beyond the contract they had signed. "You're not alone, Eleanor," Mark said softly, his voice steady. "You've never been alone. We've been in this together. We've been too afraid to admit it." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes softening as she took a step closer. "Maybe," she whispered. "But maybe we've also been too afraid to admit that we need more than what we've built. I'm starting to think that I'm tired of pretending, tired of being the person I've convinced myself I need to be." Mark reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "You don't have to pretend with me, Eleanor. Not anymore. We can figure this out. Together." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't necessary. There was an understanding between them now, an unspoken connection that had been building over time. They weren't perfect. Their marriage wasn't perfect. But it was real. The next day, as they sat together in the living room, discussing their plans for the future, Mark couldn't help but notice how different things felt. There was an ease to their conversations now, an intimacy that hadn't been there before. Eleanor was still the driven, ambitious woman she had always been, but now, there was more to her than just business. She was beginning to trust him, and with that trust came a deeper connection. Later that week, as they attended another business event together, Mark noticed how much more comfortable Eleanor seemed. She wasn't just playing the role of the perfect CEO anymore. She was engaging with people, laughing, talking about things that weren't related to work. And when their eyes met across the room, Mark saw something new in her expression, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the polished, poised Eleanor that he had first met. It was the woman he had come to know, the woman who was starting to let go of her armor and allow herself to be real. As they left the event, Mark and Eleanor walked side by side, no longer bound by the constraints of their contract, but by a growing understanding of each other. It wasn't love, at least not yet. But it was something deeper, something more meaningful, a connection that neither of them had expected, but both of them had come to cherish. To be continued. Weeks passed, and Mark and Eleanor's connection grew deeper. Their marriage, once a cold business arrangement, had transformed into something more complex, more real. They still weren't in love, not in the traditional sense, but there was a mutual respect and understanding between them that neither had expected. They had come to rely on each other in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. Eleanor, once the epitome of control and perfection, was starting to let go of the walls she had built around herself. Mark, who had once been consumed by responsibility and guilt, was beginning to embrace a future that was no longer dictated solely by duty. One afternoon, after a long week of meetings, Eleanor sat at her desk, reviewing a set of documents. Mark had been in and out of the office all day, and the house felt unusually quiet. He had been working on his own projects and spending more time outside the penthouse, trying to figure out his next steps in life. He had stopped feeling like a man trapped by his circumstances, and that realization had given him a sense of freedom he hadn't known in years. But as he walked into the office that evening, he saw Eleanor sitting there, her head bowed as she read through the papers in front of her. The weight of everything she had built was clearly taking its toll. She had always been strong, always appeared unshakable, but Mark could see the fatigue in her eyes. He had noticed it more recently, the small signs that she was starting to wear thin. She wasn't as invincible as she had once seemed. "Hey," Mark said softly, leaning against the doorframe. Eleanor looked up, startled, but the tension in her shoulders eased when she saw him. "I didn't hear you come in," she said with a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Mark walked over to her, sitting down beside her. "You've been working nonstop lately. Maybe it's time for a break," he suggested, his voice gentle. Eleanor sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know how to stop. Everything depends on T-Sun, what I've built. I can't just walk away." Mark nodded, understanding her struggle. He knew all too well what it was like to feel like everything you've worked for is at risk. But he also knew that sometimes, the most important thing was taking a step back. "I know it's hard," he said quietly. "But you don't have to do it all alone. You've got me. And I'm not going anywhere." Eleanor's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Mark saw something in her eyes, a mixture of relief and vulnerability. She didn't say anything at first, but her hand reached out, resting on his. "I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've spent so much of my life trying to be perfect, trying to keep everything together. But now I don't know what I'm doing. I feel like I'm losing myself." Mark's heart ached for her. He had seen this side of her before, but it was different now. There was no coldness, no walls. She was letting him in, and for the first time, he realized just how much she had been carrying alone. "You don't have to be perfect," Mark said softly, his voice steady and reassuring. "None of us are. But you're not losing yourself, Eleanor. You're just finding a new way to live, one that's not all about control. It's okay to take a step back and breathe. It's okay to let go of some of the weight." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. She had been holding on to this image of herself for so long, this untouchable, powerful woman. Letting go of that would mean stepping into the unknown. But the more she looked at Mark, the more she realized that she didn't have to do it alone. Maybe you're right," she whispered, her voice soft with uncertainty. "Maybe it's time to stop pretending that I have everything figured out." Mark smiled, reaching out to gently squeeze her hand. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. We've got time. And we've got each other." For the first time in a long while, Eleanor allowed herself to lean into him, the weight of her burdens finally beginning to lift. She didn't have all the answers, and that was okay. She didn't have to be perfect. And neither did Mark. Together, they could face whatever came next. As they sat there, the quiet of the room felt different. It wasn't filled with the same tension that had once defined their relationship. Instead, it was filled with understanding, with the promise that they didn't have to be perfect to be enough for each other. To be continued. Days turned into weeks, and Mark and Eleanor continued to build their lives together, not as business partners, but as two people trying to find their way. The walls that had once separated them were beginning to crumble, slowly but surely. Eleanor, once so guarded, had started to open up in ways Mark hadn't expected. She was no longer just the powerful CEO he had first met, but a woman who was learning to trust again. And Mark, who had always carried the weight of responsibility, was learning to let go of his pride and embrace the support that Eleanor offered. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But they were figuring it out, one step at a time. Together, they were navigating the complexities of their marriage, of their lives, of themselves. One afternoon, Mark and Eleanor sat together in their favorite spot in the penthouse by the window, looking out at the sprawling city below. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the room. For the first time in a long time, everything felt calm. Eleanor was no longer buried under the weight of her empire, and Mark was no longer lost in the burden of his family's struggles. "You know," Eleanor said, breaking the silence, her voice softer than it had ever been. "I didn't think I'd ever get here. I didn't think I could let go of everything I've built. But now, I see that maybe I can. And maybe that's not such a bad thing." Mark turned to her, his heart swelling with something he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something close, a deep understanding, a connection that had been forged through shared experiences and mutual respect. "You're not alone anymore," Mark said quietly. "And I'm not going anywhere either." Eleanor smiled, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "I think I'm starting to believe that," she whispered. "That maybe we can figure this out together." For a moment, they simply sat there, side by side, in the quiet of the room. The past few months had been filled with uncertainty, with moments of doubt and fear, but now, it felt like they were on the edge of something new. Something real. Mark reached for her hand, his fingers gently brushing against hers. It was a simple gesture, but it carried more weight than words could express. They weren't perfect. They hadn't solved all their problems. But they were facing them together, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. As they sat there, the sun dipping below the horizon, Mark realized that they had both found something they hadn't expected. They had found a partnership, one that wasn't built on contracts or obligations, but on trust, understanding, and the willingness to grow together. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But as Mark and Eleanor sat side by side, hand in hand, they knew they were no longer just two people trying to survive. They were building something real, something worth fighting for. "You're right," Eleanor said after a long pause, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "We can figure this out. Together." And as the city lights flickered to life outside the window, Mark knew that whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. Not as a business arrangement, but as two people who had found a way to trust, to love, and to build something better together. The end.